Okay, so I think we'll get going with our webinar today. So welcome. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jean Balfour, Managing Director of Bailey Balfour, and I'm here today to take us on a journey through how we influence at work and how the Myers-Briggs type indicator can help us to understand this and to be more impactful. I've been working with Myers-Briggs for over 20 years now, and whilst I'm qualified in and use a range of different psychometric tools, Myers-Briggs is the one I come back to the most. And for the reasons like we're going through today, I think it provides a really good level of depth and difference and things that we can really use to kind of understand ourselves and the world and how people operate at work. So a couple of things about how we're going to work together today. So to introduce you to the GoToWebinar technology, because we're using the webinar technology today, it's not actually possible for you to interact with me using voice, but you can use questions, and I would encourage you to do this. So if you have a look on the right-hand column, you should see a questions box, and please do type in questions there at any stage during the webinar, and I will pick up the questions as we go through. Because of the nature of the webinar technology, your questions are anonymous. So unless you say you want me to, I won't say who's asking the question, but I will certainly try and answer it for you. So that's there. And just also to say that we are recording today's webinar. So if you want to go back and watch it later, you can, or if you would like to share it with a colleague, that's also possible. And you should get the recording today. Say briefly a little bit about us. I think most of you know who we are. So we run leadership development, executive coaching, and diversity and inclusion. We're based in Singapore and working across APAC. And today's program sits within our leadership and people skills offer. And it kind of straddles two things, actually. So it sits with the leadership and people skills, around developing people skills, but also the psychometric profiling and assessments that we use. So we're going to do a poll. For those of you who joined us last time, you will have done this poll, but we thought we'd just get a sense of how much do you know about the Myers-Briggs type indicator, or we sometimes refer to it as MBTI, letters or something. So if you could type in there what you are, how much you know, and so we can see that, and I'll share the results in about 30 seconds so that we can see that. So as I said to you, I've been around with it for a long time. In fact, my father is a Myers-Briggs practitioner, so I've kind of grown up with Myers-Briggs. I had a little bit of an adolescent rebellion when I was a teenager, but came back to it as a practitioner now. So I'm going to close the poll and share the results so that you can all see it. Okay, so we've got a real mix of people today. We've got some practitioners on the call, some who know their type, and so presumably have done the questionnaire, others who know a bit about it, maybe have Googled it or seen it, and some of you who don't know anything at all. So the way I'm going to approach that is I am going to give a very quick introduction to it and an overview before we get into the detail of Myers-Briggs and influencing. And so if those of you who do know a lot about it, bear with us. It's just to help the people who don't know much about it so that they can come on board really. So first of all, what is the Myers-Briggs type indicator? So it's a personality profiling tool that helps us to understand ourselves and our preferences, but I think perhaps most importantly, it also helps us understand differences in others and how to value these differences. And today, in looking at influencing, in many ways, this is the area of focus that we're looking at. How do I understand myself and my preferences, and how does that impact how I influence others and interact with them? Myers-Briggs also helps us a lot with understanding how we are in teams, how we experience change, how we are as leaders. It's a tool that has multiple uses across our workplace lives and also our personal lives. And the tool was developed by a mother and daughter team, but the work was actually based on Jungian theory of personality. And when they developed the profile, what they said was that they thought that there were these 4 preference scales. So there's extraversion and introversion, which is about where we direct our energy or where we get our energy from. Sensing and intuition, which is about how we take in information. Thinking and feeling is about how we prefer to make decisions. And judging and perceiving, which is about how we approach our lifestyle. I'll say a bit more about that later on. And you'll see that in bold, we've got the coloured letters here. This is because in Myers-Briggs, we use these letters a lot to help create the profile names. And you'll see that as we go through, for those of you who are new to it. So a few key points. There's no right or wrong with Myers-Briggs. So all of the preferences are valuable and useful for us in our daily lives, and we need them. And we need all of the 16 profiles to go around, and we all use all the preferences. And those preferences, I believe, and the research shows, are lifelong. However, it doesn't mean that we're stuck with them. What it does mean is that we can develop our less preferred preferences. So whilst I have my core preferences that I think will carry with me, the preferences, the opposite preference is one that I can develop and learn and grow as I get older, and especially if I do that consciously. So just very quickly to go through these and say a bit about them. Extraversion and introversion. So people with a preference for extraversion may enjoy discussion. They're quite easily distracted sometimes because they enjoy being around people. They might be inclined to act before thinking, and they like to express themselves. Whereas people with a preference for introversion are often drawn to reflect and to develop their ideas personally before sharing them. So they might prefer to hold their thoughts in at a meeting until later on in the meeting. They tend to be good at focusing on things and often would prefer to think before acting and prefer often to keep their thoughts and feelings private, except with those that they're very close to. Sensing and intuition is about how we take in information. People with a preference for sensing prefer to work with facts, evidence and details, and people with a preference for intuition prefer to work with an overview and like to see the big picture and are influenced by inspiration. So it's really about big picture connection. Thinking and feeling, this is about how we make decisions. So people with a preference for thinking like to make decisions that are logical. They like to analyse things and look for truth and justice in the decisions that they're making. People with a preference for feeling prefer to make decisions based on the impact of people, and they tend to seek out harmony in many situations. And finally, judging and perceiving. So for those of you new to Myers-Briggs, the language isn't desperately helpful here. By judging, we mean that making a decision or judging something from that perspective, and perceiving about being open to perceiving new options. And so people with a preference for judging, we often see, prefer to have a plan and to follow their plan. They tend to want to make a decision and then stick with it. They like structure and schedules. Whereas people with a preference for perceiving prefer to look at all the options before they make a decision, and they might feel restricted by the same structure that actually might help people with a preference for judging. So those are the 4 preferences that we have, and if you have any questions, please do type them into the box now. But what those 4 preferences do is that they help us come up with these personality profiles, which you can see on here. And if you're interested in seeing more of these, they're available on the OPP website. So if you go to opp.com, you can see this and lots of other information that's available. So they're one of the 2 main providers of the Myers-Briggs materials. And what you can probably see here is that there's groupings of these, and this is where we move into how do our personality preferences impact influencing and how we influence. So if you have a look, you can probably see that the groupings are that the middle 2 letters are the same for each column. So let me just give you an example of this. So if you have a look at the first column, you can see that the first column is for people with S and T preferences. So that's the common theme that runs through that column. And this is really important for influencing because the research has shown that the preferences, the middle 2 letters on the personality profiles, is what impacts how we influence. And so it's these middle 2 letters that give us the information about how we're influencing. And just to say a little bit about each of these, so people with preferences for sensing and thinking want information that's based on sensing, so that's data and facts. They want to see some evidence. And thinking, so they want to be influenced or see things or will influence through logical analysis. For sensing and feeling, the sensing and feeling column, again, wanting that data and the evidence and the facts before they'll be prepared to move forward. But for them, it's much more about the impact on people and about seeking harmony. Harmony is present for N and F, so they also want that. They want that kind of sense of how does this relate to the people around me? If you're influencing me to do something, I'm going to connect it to people, to my values, to myself. But they also want to see the big picture. So they want to be a bit inspired. They want to kind of be connected to something. And then finally, N and T preferences. So people with N and T preferences absolutely want to be connected and inspired, but they also want to know that it's logical. And actually, they often also want to see something original. That is often an inspiring place for them. So what we see is that each of these groupings, as I've said, it helps us understand how influencing happens in Myers-Briggs. And we're going to go on and look at those a little bit more in detail. But we're going to do our second poll now. Now, those of you who know your Myers-Briggs profile will know this, and I've really simplified this down. But I thought it would be good just to see what do you think your most likely preference is. So bear in mind that this is just a guess, and also nobody else can see your preference. So if you can put in where you think your preference is, then we can share it, and that will give us an interesting understanding of who we have on the call today or where your preferences might be. While you're doing that, I want to just remind you about the reason we use the word preference is because it is our preference. So I have a preference to do this, but it doesn't mean I won't use the other preference on that same scale. So if I have a preference for extroversion, it doesn't mean that I won't use all the skills and strengths that come from having introversion. I might have to learn to do it. It might not come so naturally, but I will do it. So we are none of us kind of stuck with that, and we use the word preference to say this is my preference, like being right-handed, but I can use the other preference. Okay, let's share the results now. And we've got a pretty even spread across the group today. So we've got people with all of the different preferences, which is great, because that means maybe we'll get some questions from different preferences about that. So sensing and thinking, sensing and feeling, intuition, and feeling, and intuition and thinking. So that's great. Good. Just bear with me. Okay. So let's come back then more purely to influencing. So influencing really is about us influencing people to either come with us or to change some practice or be involved in a change initiative we're wanting. It's like we're wanting to be the bird at the front, in fact. We're wanting to lead them and hope that they will follow us without us having to tell them. So we want to encourage and entice them in that process to kind of come with us. And the challenge about influencing is that the research shows quite clearly now that when we influence, we prefer to influence using our own style. So we use what comes most naturally to us. We tend to revert to using our influencing preferences that are related to our Myers-Briggs profiles. And yet it's more important, in fact, that we do the opposite, that we really think about who is it that I'm influencing and how do I stand in their shoes. So as I've said, if this is a picture of me, it's not really me, but I'm most likely to be thinking about influencing from my own perspective, using my own preferences, but actually I'm much more likely to be successful if I flex. If I think about who's the person I'm influencing and what are their preferences going to be. Now, you might be thinking now, well, I'm not going to know that. Well, I'm going to give you some clues about that, but also sometimes we can see some possible generalizations around how that works. But the first and most important thing is that we think about building rapport, because we can't influence anybody unless we have some sort of natural rapport. And this quote from Tony Robbins is saying that rapport is the ability to enter someone's world, to make them feel that you understand them, that you have a strong common bond. And it creates that feeling of commonality so that you've got something in common with them. And there are many ways of doing this. One is obviously through conversation and connection and finding things in common. As many of you know, I often talk about the real importance of making that connection. But we can also do things like matching and mirroring to help people feel that they have a rapport when we're influencing using these different approaches. But the new research that's out, and I'm happy to share this research if anyone wants to see it, actually said that there's one overriding thing that came out of the research, and that's that we all need a level of trust and warmth before we will be prepared to enter into the influencing engagement. And so it's really key that we create that we help people feel that they can trust us, that we're influencing in an authentic way before we get into trying to influence them in any other way. Actually, I'm just going to pause there and see if anybody has any questions or any comments that they'd like to make. So if you want to do this, please go to the question box on the right-hand side and you can type them in there. And as I said at the beginning, I'll keep an eye on them so that if any come up while we're on the line, I can do that. But just if you have any questions at the moment, please do type them into the box there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through each of the 4 preference scales and give you some clues and some tips about how to influence people with those preferences. Now, of course, you don't necessarily know, so it's a bit of a guessing game sometimes, but by looking at this, you might begin to be able to see, because of the types of question that person asks, I think they might have that preference. So let's start here with people with sensing and thinking. So STs tend to, in their nature, be quite straightforward and direct, and especially if they have a preference for extraversion, you're more likely to see that. If they're introverted, they might not see it so much. So what we know about STs is that they take in information using data and facts, and they make decisions based on logical analysis. So if you're influencing somebody who's ST, what can you do? Well, it's really important that you look for providing facts, evidence and data. STs will quite often want to see a cost-benefit analysis. So for those of you with S&T preferences, you might be recognising this, but I know that certainly from S&T clients I've worked with, they'll often say, you know, even if I'm buying a fridge, I want to do a cost-benefit analysis. I want to work out what's the rationale for this, why is it a good thing? They also like to see evidence. Show me that it's worked before, and I'm much more likely to be influenced by you. And they'll want clear, concise communication and answer all the questions. So people with S&T preferences might actually have quite a few questions, and that's a good thing. Because often, especially in influencing situations, they're questions that other people haven't thought of, especially if you're NF. They're helpful questions. And so if you're influencing an ST, I would encourage you to invite those questions and to be prepared to take a good amount of time answering them. Now, if you're influencing an ST, what can you do less of? Well, the first thing is they would prefer not to have too much emotion or to see even the personal impact. It's really much more about the logic and the data. And the other one is that don't jump about from fact to fact. Look for ways to kind of present the arguments that you have in a very structured way. I can see a couple of questions here. I'm going to come on to those. I'm just going to finish these next 2 pieces and then I'll come on to those in a minute. N and F, intuition and feeling, are encouraging and inspiring. These are words that we might use with people with intuition and feeling preferences. And so you can see this is quite different to ST, sorry. So they take in information using the big picture and they make decisions by impact on people. So if you're influencing somebody who you think might have N and F preferences, what can you do? Well, first of all, see if you can be creative and find ways to kind of enact their imagination to help them see how this might be fun and inspiring and to kind of help them to be enthused. But in order for that to happen, you might want to be enthused. You might need to be kind of engaged with that. Share high-level information and look for a vision. And if you can't If you can't create that vision, and perhaps you have ST preferences and that you find that a bit harder, work with them, collaborate with them to come up with the vision. So do that in a way that's together. And the final piece here is that see if there's a way to help connect the influencing situation, the thing that you're influencing on, to how to help people grow, because NFs are very motivated to help people grow in their world. What can you do less of? Well, too much detail switches them off. So for NFs, if you go in with a real data, lots and lots of data, and it's too cool and analytical, then they're going to be very hard to influence. You're going to really struggle to get them to go where you want. SF, so these are practical collaborative people. They have sensing and feeling preferences. Again, they want the data and the facts, but they also want to see impact on people and values. So what can you do more of? Well, actually, for people with sensing and feeling preferences, they take a very personal, caring approach to life. And so they would always like to start from you listening, from taking a conversational approach so that you can engage with them, hear their perspective as they would yours, so that's how they would approach it, and work with them in a very collaborative way. Using personal examples can help, and I'm going to give you an example of this shortly, and sharing the practical impact and the benefits for people can be good, and just being generally respectful. I sometimes will say that, you know, people with SNF preferences are the people who are very practically caring, and so if they feel that you are returning that, then that will be a good thing. So what you want to do less of is be too dry and to be too theoretical and woolly, because that won't work for SFs. And finally, NT. So people with intuition and thinking, reasoned and convincing. They like big picture to take in information. They're going to make the connections between things, and they want a logical analysis. Actually, I didn't put it up here, but my first suggestion for influencing NTEs is always help them to see how this is novel and creative and innovative, or how they can make it novel and creative and innovative, because NTs like to be connected to things that are new, that are kind of moving forward, that are strategic, and so helping to do that is really good. They also value competence. So if you are trying to influence to do something, you need to demonstrate that you understand it, that you're competent in that field and that you really get it. And they would like logic and some research, not too much detailed research, but evidence that you've got that and that you know that that research is there. Again, be less emotional, and see if you can provide examples. Don't provide examples that are not evidence-based, because my experience of working with NTs is they're quite often the people who are asking the question, well, why? You know, why should we be doing that? And so you want to be really thought through what the rationale is, what the evidence for is, and really keeping that in that way. So I'm going to pause there. There are a couple of questions here, so I'm just going to have a look at those. And so somebody's said, can your preference change whilst you're progressing in your career? So the answer is both yes and no to this. So let me start with a no answer. And the theory suggests, and I think probably backed up by some of the neuroscience, that our core preferences are with us through life. So we develop them in early childhood or at birth. Some researchers are saying that they think extraversion and introversion, for example, is hardwired before birth. But the other side of this is that can your preference change is actually, of course it can, because we can learn to use the other preference and get very, very skilled at it. So if I give you an example of this, and bear with me for those of you who've heard this example, I've done a lot of work with academic doctors, and I've been coaching some academic surgeons. Now, you would really hope that your surgeon has a preference for sensing, so is in the detail. And you really want to hope that they know the details and that they can kind of be factual and tangible. And some of the surgeons I've coached have a preference for intuition. They're really in the big picture and the high level. Now, these particular surgeons are considered gifted and are going on to have fantastic careers. And so what they demonstrate is that they have learned the sensing preference. They are very, very good, practical, hands-on surgeons, and they've learned to do it. They're also very good at the big picture and intuition, and perhaps that's why they go into academia, because they're looking for opportunities with that. The other thing is that if you're working in an environment which is slightly different to your natural preferences, so say you're an introvert and you're working in an extroverted environment, then it's quite likely that you will learn to become more extroverted, that you will learn to demonstrate more extroverted behaviour, and most importantly, that you'll become more comfortable with it, and that it will become a bit more natural. Now, the neuroscience is saying that we can reprogram our brain, we can regrow neural pathways, and so I do feel optimistic that if we choose to, we can change these things. I also believe that our core preferences are still there. They don't go away. They're still part of us. So I hope that's answered the question. Somebody's asked a question, is there a preferred style at different levels of leadership? So the first answer to this is there's no preferred style for anything, because we can have all of the 16 profiles, can learn and adapt because of what I've just been talking about to be good leaders at any level of the organisation. However, what we do see is a very practical, a very higher predominance of people with a preference for intuition in more senior and strategic roles. So we do see that. However, there's some good examples where that hasn't happened, so it's a kind of chicken and egg. So Jeff Bezos, for example, the speculation is that he has ISTJ preferences, which is strong sensing. And so he would buck that trend of what we see. Certainly my experience is of the people I coach is that the more senior they are, the more likely they are to have preference for intuition. But as I said, Jeff Bezos, one of the world's grand leaders at the moment, so it doesn't follow through that you have to have that preference to be good. You can be a perfectly fantastic leader with a preference for sensing as well. So we see some natural filtering, but it doesn't follow that therefore it means that you're not going to be good at that level. Somebody else has asked this question about, can your Myers-Briggs type change as you age, as you become, say, you're extroverted and more introverted? So my own experience, so I have a preference for extroversion. That may not be a surprise to you, but that again, you see, that could have been me borrowing extrovert behaviour to do that. But I do have a preference for extroversion, and what I've really noticed about myself is that I as I get older, I much prefer to have time alone. So when I was 17, if I was on my own for an hour on Saturday, it was devastating. I know I'm going to be on my own through choice this Saturday, and I'm really looking forward to it. So we do change, and we can grow with that. And yeah, certainly I will share the research with you. It's actually also available on the OPP website. Great, so thanks for those questions. Keep them coming. I'm going to go on now and just share a couple of really practical stories about how this works. I'm going to start. I have worked in healthcare quite a lot, so I was involved in a project that was a big improvement project. This was about 4 years ago now, and we were trying to influence the elderly care consultant. So these are you might have called them geriatricians in the old days, people working with elderly people, to get involved in this new way of working. And because our working assumption was that doctors are like data and facts and logic, we were using a very cool data-based argument to get them involved. And we were showing them things called run charts and spreadsheets, and we were drowning them in data because we thought that would be what would influence them to get involved. And then I had a kind of a bit of a penny dropping moment. I was coaching then an elderly care consultant, and we did her Myers-Briggs profile, and it came out that she had sensing and feeling preferences, S and F. And I don't know if you remember, but people with sensing and feeling preferences have a particularly, first of all, collaborative, but also a very personal approach. And it dawned on me that by using this kind of cool data, we weren't going to get these people's buy-in at all. They were people who cared about the patient. The patient was at the heart of their journey. They took a very personal caring to each of the elderly patients they were working with. So we changed the strategy, and one of the team went off and found a couple of patient stories. They went and pulled some patients' notes where the patient hadn't actually had a very good journey in the hospital, and they wrote the story up And we shared the story with the elderly care consultants and showed how this new approach to working would have helped this patient have a better experience. And it was like magic. Immediately they signed up, said, great, now you've convinced us. The data didn't work, but tell us how it impacts our patients, and we're in. So what we saw was that the people who were doing in fact, the influencing, we know they had intuition and thinking, and the people we were trying to influence had sensing and feeling. And so it wasn't until we flexed our style that that was able to happen. The second example is engineering. So I do some work with one of the big global engineering firms, and we do a workshop on influencing for them. And I was working with some of the marketing team who were saying that they were really, really struggling to get the engineers involved early on in projects when they were bidding for work. And they really, what happened was that the marketing team and the engineering teams would come together very late in the day, and it would actually lead, they thought, to less effective bidding processes. So we started to look at the preferences, and we started with the likely preferences of marketing, possibly intuition and feeling. It's making big generalizations with all of these. But also there's pretty good evidence to show that a lot of engineers have sensing and thinking, ST preferences. And so we talked about, what were the marketing people doing? And they said, well, we go in there and we try and help them feel good about it and engage with them. And then the penny dropped again for them, and they said, wait a minute, we need to give them data. So what they did was they went away and looked for examples of where they had bid for work and they'd worked early on with the engineers and where they'd won the work. And they found lots of examples, actually, and they could see that actually there was good evidence. So they then flexed their style, went with the evidence. If you engage with us earlier on, we think this is good for business. And, of course, the engineers welcome them in through the door. And, in fact, what happened was they did win some work as a result of flexing that style. So it was simple, but it did involve really thinking it through and really being very practical in that way of kind of helping to think it through. So I've got some final tips for you. We've also got a bit of time for questions if there are any questions that anybody has. So my final thoughts are that we have to start by noticing our own influencing style. So if you don't know your Myers-Briggs profile, then you can hopefully use some of that language today to kind of see how that works and think about your own preferences. Perhaps one of the places to do this is to start by thinking about how you like to be influenced. So, I know how I like to be influenced, and I'm much more likely to influence others in that way. And so you really want to think about that, and that's really the first place to go in influencing. And then we need to be prepared to flex our style, because if we've tried that and tried our own approach and it's not working, then it's really important that we try another approach and we borrow it. And because you probably won't know the preferences of the people you're influencing, you might have to borrow a bit from each of those preference scales. And I will share with you the research so that you can see that, and there's quite a bit of stuff in there that you might need to borrow from each of those in order to get it right, to kind of find something that's going to help you with that. I've already said this, but I can't say it enough. Always stand in the shoes of your people you're influencing. So because of this place that we go where it's about us, if you really just think about going and thinking about the person, taking some time. If they're a group of people, think about them as a group, but also think about them as individuals. The engineers, some of those engineers will have had a preference for sensing and thinking, but some of them won't. It was just that it kind of got the group. That sometimes you'll need to think about people really as individuals in that space. Excuse me. And then finally, try a range of approaches, as I've said. So if one approach doesn't work, look for another one, try another one, talk to some people, find out what have they done, how have they influenced people in that situation, and see how you can do that so that you can move it on. So that's kind of all from me on a little introduction to influencing and how you use influencing strategies and Myers-Briggs and how you link them together.